I've always had an interest in crime, especially in this country. I've always had an interest in... I've been in prison with a few people that are convicted of crimes they didn't commit. I've always been interested in murder, and sadly it's part of my family life. And I suppose that's where the interest comes from. So I decided to set up a Facebook group with my interest. I know a lot of people are interested in crime, and I set up a page called Miscarriages of Justice. On the page, we just raise awareness for people's stories, in depth pictures, the whole story, all the details, and we discuss them, and we raise awareness for them, so these cases don't get forgotten about, so they're not brushed under the carpet, so these people get their voices heard. I'm starting these series of documentaries with a piece about me to introduce myself, so you know my reasonings behind doing it, so you know the energy behind it, so you know my story, and to give these men and women a voice. Giving people a voice is important to me because I was controlled into not having a voice. And if I'd have had a voice, my circumstances as a child could have been different. My circumstances as a teen could have been different. And my circumstances as an adult could have been different. If I wasn't scared to have a voice, I maybe could have changed what happened.
What we often find with people who suffer trauma in early childhood and repeated trauma throughout their life, when they've sought counselling or treatment, in that they've found a way to discuss it and talk about it, they find the voice that they've had taken away for all those years, and they start to explore what that means to have a voice. And with Will, what you see is typical in that sense. He found his voice, and he then wants to use that voice to support and help other people. And that's quite an important part of his own recovery, his own processing of what he went through as a child and then as an adult. And so doing the series where he started looking at miscarriages of justice and exploring these issues was a way of using his voice in a positive way to support and help other people, and also to give a sense of purpose and meaning to what happened to him. If he's able to help other people, then he's also able to give that purpose and meaning to his own issues and what's happened to him.
When I got released from prison the last time in 2016, I went into an abstinence project, and they put me on a program, and I got clean from drugs and alcohol, and I started to realise that I didn't need these things and started to live semi-crime free. And I accessed counselling, and I was against it from the fucking start. I didn't want to do it. I was told that psychologists and counsellors are all pricks and they don't know what they're talking about, and that it's all a load of bollocks, and they use fancy buzzwords, and they just, it's all bollocks basically. But something within me wanted to do it. Something within me needed it. I went along and it didn't go the way I thought it was going to go. The first couple of sessions I just rejected and wouldn't really talk about anything that was painful to me, because it was out of my comfort zone. I don't like emotion. I get angry instead of getting sad, because I've always been taught emotion is a weakness. So to combat that weakness, I fight. But eventually things that were being said and things that were coming out of me started to make sense. I started to realise about ACEs. I started to realise that there's a reason, there's a pattern, and that I am a good person deep down, and that I have got a personality, and I have got parts of me that are likeable. And I feel ashamed looking back, because I didn't need to do the things I did. I've not got any gains from the things I did. It's messed up my chances for a lot of things in life. People view me in a certain way now. I'll always be branded with the tag of the things I've done. Part of the reasons I did it was the thrill. There was a considerable financial element to, especially the cash points, but the thrill, and I enjoyed the planning of the actual events, and because I knew no different. I grew up in a criminal household where that was the norm. I didn't know any better. I was born into a criminal family. My dad, my uncle, other male relatives were all career criminals. My mother had severe mental health problems. My dad would be out during the day doing whatever he did. Nobody ever asked questions. And while we were in my mother's care, she was vacant. She was never there. She was there, but not in person, like not in her mind. We was neglected on a good day. Assaults would take place. We were left on the floor by the back door in our nappies, and soiled nappies, and ants would come in from outside and would be all infested in our nappies, and we'd be screaming on the floor. My dad would come home and then beat my mother up in front of us. I remember one time when I was on the floor, my mother was boiling a hot pan of water to chuck all over us, and my dad got in between and burnt all of his back and then battered my mother to a pulp in front of me. My mother used to blame me for my dad beating her up when she was taking us to play school and nursery with black eyes. She'd say that the black eyes had come from me headbutting her or kicking her while she was changing my bum. She would blame me for her injuries that was done by my father. She would blame me for injuries to my brother. When I got older, my mother and my father used to lock me in a cupboard all day long. The only time they'd open a door was to chuck in a pack of Wotsits. Sometimes I wasn't even allowed to go to the toilet, so I'd just have to wee and poo myself in the cupboard. There was never a light on in there. I just spent a few years of my childhood in complete isolation, and the only time they would open it would be to either batter me or to chuck me a bag of crisps. Makes me realise that that's probably why I enjoyed prison so much, if I'm honest, because my circumstances in prison were a lot safer, cleaner and better than my circumstances I grew up in. I was comfortable in my surroundings. My father, although I didn't realise it at the time, my father was a brutal man, and my father would not only batter my mother on a daily basis, my father would batter me and my brothers with no care in the world. Some of the things that stuck with me more than the normal assaults were things like, for example, when he would smack our heads together to the point that my ears were bleeding, drag us around the house by our ankles. He'd never hold our hands. We always had to walk behind him anywhere. We never were allowed out the house to see friends. Never had Christmas presents, birthday presents. My dad would take us places and stop off in the entrance of places like Cheshunt World of Adventures, knowing full well we'd get excited, thinking we're going there, and then he would go and use the toilet and then drive us off somewhere else. My dad used to put me in stress positions. My dad would waterboard me. But at the time, I just thought everybody's childhood was like this. I blamed myself. I thought it was because I hadn't done something right. that I deserved the punishments I was getting, and that the next day I should try harder, and that the people that got presents and didn't have the life that I had were rich or lucky. I don't know. I was the only kid to have second-hand clothes to wear to school, although my dad made plenty of money from the things that he did. I'd come to school with bruises, but they were in places that nobody would really notice. I had no confidence. My only thing that saved me from being bullied was fighting, because I saw violence at home, so violence was my answer to things. The only happy days in school would be when my nan would pick me up. When my mother was imprisoned and my father was awarded joint custody with my nan, he shortly after met a new partner, and part of me thought that the abuse, although I didn't see it as abuse, would stop, but the abuse didn't stop, it continued. This continued for years until I got to 11, 12 and started getting a voice myself, started developing a personality, started answering back. By now the beatings, they didn't take no effect. One day when me and my brother was at nursery, my mother's twin sister and her partner came and picked us up from nursery in a little Bedford Rascal van, told the nursery that we had an appointment that day, put us in the back of the van, and they effectively kidnapped us. They left my dad a Dear John letter, literally, because his name was John. And my dad didn't even know, wasn't even aware till he came home. They took us to Wales, and when we were in Wales, we were in a women's refuge with my mother. And during the day, when my mother was allowed out of the refuge with me and my brother, they would take me to my auntie's, and my uncle and my auntie would abuse us. And then when we went back to the women's refuge with my mother would physically abuse us in the refuge until other mothers there noticed. Staff were informed and they got in contact with the police, and my mother was arrested. My mother was sentenced to 5 years and given an exclusion zone of where she wasn't allowed contact, and she wasn't allowed within a certain mile radius of where we were. I've seen my auntie's partner since, and it didn't go well. I had to get dragged off of him by 3 people, and if I saw him again, I can't promise that it wouldn't happen again. Oddly enough, I'm more angry at him than I am my mother and my mother's twin sister. But I think because I'm so used to the people that are supposed to love and care for me doing things they shouldn't do, that it was just another element of my childhood. It's not something that I think about often. It's one of the things I've put in a box, and I don't really open that box much. My dad was then awarded joint custody with my nan, and we remained in his care until I was 14, 15. I thought things would change. I thought that my mother was the problem, that she was now getting punished, and that things would get better, that I would have things like other kids had. I think I've always loved my nan, and I thought initially that it would be, like it was explained in court, 50-50, that 50% of my time would be spent with my nan, 50% of my time would be spent with my dad, and it would just be us, I quickly realised that wasn't the case, that my dad was having us 99% of the time, and when he met a new partner, I was excited about that too. I thought that maybe she would be the woman to change my father, she would be the woman to actually be a mother, but no, the abuse continued, even from her. My dad was controlling over my nan. I think my nan would have had us full time. My dad's sister is disabled, so a lot of my nan's time is spent going to visit her, looking after her. But even so, I think, given the choice, my nan would have had us full time, and she would have done a really good job. My nan is the only goodness in me comes from my nan. My nan. I've got to stop a minute. I can't talk about my nan.
As we explore Will's story, what you start to realise is when you look at the adverse childhood experiences, the ACEs covers 10 areas. There's depth of how you look at each area and what could be involved in them. And what you start to realise is that actually Will ticks all 10 boxes. You have the emotional neglect, the physical neglect, the abuse, which is physical abuse, sexual abuse, the emotional abuse as well. And then you have all the different areas of dysfunction within the family. And, you know, when we look at ACEs, we're often looking at what does it mean if someone has, you know, the 3 ACEs, the 4 ACEs, 5 ACEs, 6 ACEs. In Will's case, you are looking at 10 ACEs. So what makes it quite incredible in his story is that he was able to, over time, process, deal with it, and start to build a life where he's trying to create as much of an ACEs-free future for his own children through the understanding that he's gained. But part of his understanding has to be processing his childhood, and that's not an easy journey for anyone when you've been through the amount of trauma that he went through. But it's also looking at the fact that it's very difficult sometimes for people to recognise the ACEs that they have when they feel that was just their normal childhood. So when Will first started talking about a lot of things that happened in his childhood, he talked about it as if it was normal within how children are brought up. The isolation, the poor treatment, the neglect, the physical abuse, all of that was normal. It was the childhood he saw as normal for him and his brother. And when he did start to process as an adult in the last few years and realise that this was far from normal, what actually started that processing stage in a large part was having children of his own and questioning that he didn't want them to feel the way he had felt as a child, and therefore realising there was something wrong with that treatment, there was something wrong with being placed in the kind of position that he had been as a child. So he had to go on a journey of finding himself, not just as a father, but finding himself as who is he, what is his identity. And that means also questioning the things that have happened to you, the way you've been treated, the choices you made. And that in turn can bring a lot of guilt, a lot of questioning, a lot of anger. And so that has to be processed as well. And you see that through his story. But equally, part of understanding how far Will's come is the fact that he can tell that story. And a few years ago, he certainly wouldn't have been able to do that. Whereas now he is able to discuss it and talk about it, to seek out points of empathy, to build up a resilience against future trauma as a result of it.
For years, from the years following my mother's imprisonment, the abuse continued. We'd go without meals. We weren't allowed to go in the fridge by ourselves or any of the things that normal kids do. We were given 3 meals a day, and that's what we had. There was no having seconds. There was no having what was left over. We got what we were given, whether we liked it or not. We had to eat it. If we didn't eat it, we were force fed it, and I mean literally force fed it, to the point that my dad or my stepmom would force the fork down my throat. If I was sick on the plate, I had to eat that as well. I wasn't allowed to leave the table till it was all gone, regardless of if I needed to be sick or use the toilet. Some days we would just go without food. This continued up until I was about 11, 12. We weren't allowed to move freely about the house. I don't know what my living room looked like. I don't know what their bedroom looked like. The only rooms we were allowed to go into was the kitchen to eat food, and that was only when we were called. I've only been in my childhood home garden once, and that was staged for a picture for social services. The only time we were allowed in the living room was with them and to watch the news. Never even watched kids programs as a child, other than at my nan's. I think I liked my nan's so much because my nan would give us a choice over what we were allowed to eat. My nan would let us sit there and watch cartoons. My nan would buy us sweets if we were out. My nan showed us a care and love that we hadn't seen before. But yeah, as I said, this continued up until I got to 11, 12, started developing an attitude, started not being bothered by the assaults, not being bothered by things that were normal by now. I'd started getting into trouble, hanging around with older lads, stealing mopeds, committing small crimes. Quickly realised that I was in a different league to friends of my own age. Quickly realised that I was quite good at the things that I was doing. And I come home from school one day and my father turfed me out, said, "You're not coming in." I was 13 years old, still in my school uniform. It was the middle of November, so it was dark, it was raining, and my dad said, "You're not coming in." And panic set in. All my friends had gone home or were out somewhere. I didn't know where they were. I didn't have a phone or any way of contacting them. So panic set in. I walked around for hours trying to find anyone I knew. It dawned on me then that no one I knew by now was out, so I'd have to walk around all night. I could have gone and slept on a bench, but I didn't feel safe. So I walked around all night, freezing cold, soaking wet, and the first night was the worst. I sat on a park bench. I made sure the bench was backed up against a wall so nobody could come behind me, and I tried to stay awake as long as I could. The following day, I met my brother on the way to school, and my brother gave me his packed lunch because he knew the situation. He gave me his packed lunch. I felt bad taking it from him, but I was starving. I took that from him. I said, "Is there any chance of me coming back to the house?" He said, "No, he's not having it." He was crying, but there was nothing he could do. He could end up in the same predicament, and I didn't want him to go through that. all my childhood I tried to protect him from things, and I happily took beatings instead of him, especially as we got older. So it got into a system of I would stay awake all night walking around, stealing food from shops to survive, and then going to school to sleep, or going to a friend's house who was bunking off school and sleep there. Before long, I was really good at stealing and had a nice little routine set up. Had a half decent place under a leisure centre to sleep, which was, I felt, safe and secure. And that continued until I started going to prison. Social services got involved. Eventually I got expelled from school for my behaviour, for my lack of attendance, for my attitude, for all the things I was doing. I got expelled from school. No other school in the borough would take me back. They put me in a pupil referral unit. I got expelled from 2 of them. The youth offending team was connected to the pupil referral unit, and they came to me one day when I was in the pupil referral unit and said that my dad had threatened to stab me to death if I went back to the house, and that I've got nowhere to go. And he told them that I had nowhere to go, although I hadn't even been living there. So the youth offending team and social services sat down with me and said, you've got 2 choices. You can go into foster care in London, or you can go and try and live with your mother in Wales. So years had passed since I'd even thought of my mother. I'd often over the years wondered if I would have been better living with her. And I knew kids that were in foster care in London, and it was a bleak existence for them. So I chose to go with my mother. They went and bought me a ticket for the National Express coach and gave me £20, put me on the bus, and that was it. I went to Wales. I didn't end up with my mother. I got to Hereford about 11 o'clock at night, never been to Hereford. There was a taxi waiting for me with a guy named Brian. It was pitch black. They drove me all the way to my mother's address, up a country lane, up the lane to her house. So there you go, it's that house there. The taxi drove off. I knocked on a door. My mother, who I didn't recognise, I could tell it was my mother, but my mother come to the door. She said, what the fuck are you doing here? So I told her, like, social services have sent me here. She said, you're not fucking staying here. And slammed the door in my face. And all the excitement and stuff that built up on the way there, of maybe I'm going to a new life, and it just went in that instant. It's just gone, deflated. I like putting a pin in a balloon. I turned round away from the light of the doorway and realised I'm screwed. I didn't know where I was. It was pitch black. It's the countryside, so there wasn't street lights. At this time, I had a small little phone which had a torch on the back of it. It wasn't brilliant, but I used that to find my way back down the track. I fell over a few times with potholes and stuff. And I found this little lane, and I walked down this lane, and then there was this massive, I guess it was an oak tree, and under this tree was dry. So I stood under this tree for a while, crying, didn't know what to do. And I thought, well, I'm just going to have to stay here. I couldn't see any lights in the distance, couldn't see any lights behind me. So I tucked my trousers into my socks, put my hood up, pulled my hands into my jacket, curled up in a ball under the tree. Slept there till the morning, till the crack of dawn. Woke up freezing, shaking like a shitting dog. Soaking wet. Got up. Phone was dead by now. I walked out of the field that I was in, walked a little bit down this lane, and I got to a main road. I looked one way, couldn't see anything but road and hedges. Looked the other way, and in the distance I could see a garage and what looked like a pub. I still had the money that was given to me, and I was dying for a fag and a drink. So I walked up to this garage. It was probably about half a mile away. Walked up there, walked in, got a pack of fags, got a drink, went back out the garage, and I just stood there for 10 minutes having a fag. And I thought, well, I need to get warmed up. So I went into this pub when it eventually opened, ordered a half a Coke. I found a little booth in a corner, and I sat there all day pretending to read leaflets and stringing out this glass of cola as long as I could. The landlady of this pub come over. She sat down opposite me, and I thought she was going to turf me out or kick off at me being there or something. And she sat down and she said, do you want another drink? So I said, yeah, I haven't got no money left though. She said, no, it's fine. I burst out into tears and I told her what had happened. And she knew my mother. My mother and my stepfather used to visit the pub frequently. And she said, between me and her, I can stay in the caravan at the back of the pub. She's got a couple of other lads, a bit older than me, but they help out. And she said I can work for my keep. And that's what I did until my mother grassed her up to social services. And got carted off back to London to face more charges. But by this point, I'd already been up in front of several judges in London every other week, and they knew me on first name basis, which is never good. Because I was currently living in Wales and my charges were in London, they transferred me over to the youth offending team in Wales. I then went back to Wales, went into a foster care home.
When we look at Will's history when he moved into his own place, he was a young boy, a young man at that stage, no life skills. He didn't know how to cook for himself, didn't know some basic skills about just surviving on his own. He was set up to fail. He was destined to fail, and he fell into what he knew, which was crime, and he was good at it. And the thing is that when you've not been particularly good at anything, when you find something you're good at, you're going to build on that. And he very quickly went from being in a vulnerable state where criminal influences around him used him and brought him into doing things, to surpassing them and realising that he was better at it than them. And with that, building a set of skills that if he'd had the right advice or guidance at those critical periods in his life, could have been skills that developed him in a very positive way. Instead, it's what turned him into a life of crime, which then led to a dependence on drugs, alcohol, and the increase in criminal behaviour that came with that, and the survival nature which aces children as they're growing up. That's what they fall into. They have to survive. They'll survive however they're able to. And in order to survive, they lose or never develop empathy, because if you have empathy, you wouldn't be able to do a lot of what it takes to survive. And so we see Will at this sort of stage of his life as someone who is about survival. It's about making certain choices that he was kind of set up to make. He hadn't developed certain skills, as I said, life skills, but he also hadn't developed certain emotional skills and the ability to question the choices that he was making, and to develop a conscience with it at that stage. And when you're in survival mode, you can't really afford to have a conscience with it, or you wouldn't do the things that you do, which means later on when you do start to question and develop the conscience and the empathy, it can be quite horrific to deal with the choices that you made, the bad decisions that you made, the people that you've hurt along the way. And that guilt can become very destructive. And it takes a lot of work to turn that into a positive and try and rebuild from it, which is what Will had to do.
When I reached 16, social services decided that I was ready for a flat. Quickly I got manipulated and the flat became a party flat, and and then I got burgled and didn't feel comfortable in my flat. Yeah, it was a mess. They didn't give me any life skills. I didn't know how to make any food. I didn't even know how to use an oven. I didn't have no budgeting skills. I gave my flat up because I couldn't handle the tenancy. I didn't feel safe in the tenancy. I used to sit on the floor by the door with a hammer every night, thinking people were going to come in. Social services put me in a bed and breakfast, and just left me there. They didn't come visit me. I had panic attacks, not through fear, but through worry about, I don't know, really, just worry and the fact that I was in the same sort of situation again. Eventually then they put me, it wasn't foster care, they put me in like shared accommodation with other ex-care leavers. Across the road was a lifer. He'd done a lot of armed robberies and stuff like that, and he was a bully. And he used to come over to the property. One of his girlfriend lived in the property, and he quickly clocked on that I was vulnerable and that I was a criminal as well, and used to bully me into doing things with him, and it spiralled out of control from there. I got addicted to coke, so I needed money to fund my habit. Got to the stage where I outgrew him and got different mates that are into even worse crime, and that's where, in my mind, that's where it all went wrong. I already had mistrust in me. I was always told never to talk to authorities. I was angry about the situation that I was in. I was angry that when things started going well, they went tits up again. I was angry that I had to commit crime to survive, but then part of me enjoyed it at the same time. I knew that I could rely on crime, whereas I couldn't rely on authority. I couldn't rely on anybody else but myself. And although criminal, the skills that I knew, that's the only thing I could rely on. I didn't talk to anybody about what was going on, psychologically or otherwise. I didn't talk to anybody about how I felt. I probably could have got myself out of some of the messes if I'd have spoken to people, but it was battered into me all my life not to talk to anyone.
When I first met Will, he came along to counselling, and he made it very clear at the start with the counselling that he didn't believe in counselling. He didn't need it. He didn't want it. He didn't trust me, didn't trust the system. He was angry at even being there and very vocal about how angry he was and very loud about it and very negative about having to work with me and, making sure I always knew that. But what was quite interesting is nobody was making him go to counselling. It was a choice. And nobody was making him come back every week, but he was coming back every week, even if he was coming back to tell me how much he didn't want to be there. And that was kind of the open door, where if he had, a lot of people when they're going through dealing with their ACEs as adults, their choice is not to deal with it. So they wouldn't come back to counselling. They wouldn't come in the first place, but they certainly wouldn't come back after 1 or 2 sessions until they're ready, which could be a long time into the future. Will did keep coming back, and through the conversations began to question a lot of things about his past and about his understanding of things. And the anger and that edge were still there for a long time. And slowly, he dealt with that on his own. It wasn't a case of what I was doing. He's very much a processing person. He thinks about things. He goes away and thinks about it and looks at the reasons behind things, and then brought that understanding to the conversations that we were having, and went on that journey, difficult as it was, and it was a very difficult journey for him, but he was prepared to go on that journey even though it had its price. There was a lot of pain in having to look at himself and question so many of the things he'd always taken as a given. So, his father had always taught him, don't trust psychologists, counsellors, any of these kind of people. You can't trust them. They're out to harm you. And he had that voice in the back of his head all the time and had to combat that with the fact that what was happening didn't bear out that was true. And then that would cause him to question things about how he'd been brought up, about his father, about the things that he had accepted as normal, and the fact that they weren't normal, whatever normal is, but that they were quite abusive and harmful and had caused him a lot of pain at the time and in the future as a result of that.
My dad is now serving a life sentence for murder, and my mother is now deceased. My opinion of my dad has changed. I now realise that the abuse my dad gave me was worse than psychologically was worse than the abuse my mother gave me. It had longer lasting effects. It was for a longer period of time. It affected me for a longer period as well. I've forgiven my mother now for the things that happened. I understand mental health a lot more now than I did then. I believe to a certain extent my mother was just as much a victim as I was, as my brother was. And I believe my dad is a sadistic, narcissistic psychopath, and he deserves everything he gets. And I hope one day my dad watches this and sees that he hasn't broke me. I hope he sees, I don't know what I hope. I just hope he sees this and realises he hasn't fucking broke me, and I'm still here. I'm here because of him. I've got all these scars on me and all these scars in here because of him. It's him that's done this to me. I've hurt people in my life and been in situations I didn't want to be in my life because of him. Because of the things he taught me and tried to make me be like him. I'm here because of him. But he's not my legacy. Proving him wrong is my legacy. By fighting against what he wants me to be. By telling my story. By speaking. Like, he always taught me not to speak, and now I realise it was to cover up what he was doing, to cover up the fact that he wasn't a man, to cover up the fact that he was a coward and a bully. And I'm doing a big thing now by standing up and telling my fucking story, and other people will see this and they'll hopefully get confidence to tell their story and stand up to the bullies in their life. I'm breaking the cycle with my kids as well. I don't have to be him. I don't have to do what his father done to him, and I don't have to do what he done to me. I can be a role model to my kids, and I can raise my kids in the right way. I'm done for now. I can't do no more. I look in the mirror, all I see is my father, and I hate it. It makes me angry. When I've been with old criminal associates of mine who have been criminal associates of my father, they treat me in a certain way, in a certain respect, like they would for my father. And I don't want that. I don't want that lifestyle. I don't want my son to grow up looking like me and having the same thoughts. I want to break away from everything that he's about. When I get angry, or used to get angry, I hear my father, I see my father. The thing is, like all my life, my father justified what he'd done to me because I looked like my mother. But then my mother used to hate me, and I think, is it because I look like my father? And I'm not bothered about the way I look. I don't want elements of my father's personality coming out in mine. I don't want elements of my mother's personality coming out in mine.
The fact that Will has lived through, all 10 aces and, has had a large part of his life with a criminal record, criminal past, he also had this belief that ultimately nobody could be trusted, that the only person you can trust is yourself, that the system can't be trusted, that anybody offering help has an ulterior motive, they'll let you down. All of that was in his head. But with that also came the idea that you might as well destroy it before it destroys you. So when things are good, it's temporary. So initially his view was, well, you have to destroy these positive things because they are going to turn on you, or people you trust will let you down, so push them away at the start. So he's had to learn to fight that and to take that leap of faith, which is really hard when you've been through your entire life having been let down by the system, by the people who were supposed to care for him, love him, make him feel safe. All those people constantly let him down. So as an adult now, to take that leap of faith is not at all an easy thing to do. On top of that, what you also see with aces is that guilt that I've mentioned previously, where he'll make a mistake, or he'll maybe make a bad choice or a bad decision, and he has to resist that belief that everything's going to go to hell then, that he's no good. One wrong decision, then everything's destroyed, everything's ruined, that he is no good, that he's not worth anybody trying to support or help. That lack of self-worth and self-confidence, it's a constant battle against that he's going to be fighting for a long time. And although he has developed so much and the skills to work with that, it's still a default that he has to struggle with when it happens. So you will see, if he makes a bad choice, say, it will be, well, everybody's going to leave me, everybody's going to stop supporting me, nobody's going to care, and I deserve that. That belief that he deserves to not be trusted or not be supported, because that also got drilled into him as a child, that he was worthless, that he wasn't deserving of love. And I think when your own parents drill into you that you're not deserving of love, that's a very hard thing to get over into your adulthood, because they are your primary caregivers. They're the people who should love you unconditionally, be there for you unconditionally. And when that's never happened, developing as an adult is always going to be troubled by that. And so what we see with Will is I think he's definitely found himself as a father, and that's an incredible achievement, and he's based it on his knowledge of right and wrong and offering that unconditional love to his children that he never got as a child. But I think he's still very much on the journey of discovering who he is as a person. That his whole identity isn't in being a father. That's part of his identity, but he has to still pursue that journey of discovering the other aspects of himself. And I think he's reached a stage of realising that it's not about the end of that journey, that the journey is what's important. It's a journey of discovery that's going to keep going throughout his life and the different stages of his life as things change. And the journey can be very difficult at times, but it's also rewarding and enjoyable. And I think that's kind of where he's at just now with things. Sometimes he has to remind himself that it is a rewarding journey and that it won't all fail if, there's a problem along the way or an obstacle, that he's learned much more about an obstacle doesn't mean walk away, run away. It means stay and overcome it. And the more he's learned to do that, the more he's finding himself in the process.
I guess I was lost for years and still am to a certain extent. I'm a father, I know that much, and I'm a damn sight better father than he'll ever be. And I know that as my personality, but outside of that, I don't know. I'm enjoying finding myself, but it's a massive learning curve. But the more I learn, the more I realise that I didn't need him. Do you know what I mean? I don't need to be scared of him. I realised that I do have potential and that I don't have to get angry and smash things up in every situation. And I've learnt to analyse the situation, and if I've failed at something or messed something up, to tie my shoes up again and get on with it, to keep my head up and try again. And if it fails, just keep going back at it. And realised I didn't need crying. That was a big thing. I cut all my ties with people.
Part of Will's journey to finding himself has also, he's come that full circle of when you have a voice, how do you use that voice? When you recognise that things that happened to you weren't right and you start to speak out about it and almost face or challenge your fears, you also want to help other people do the same and speak out for those who maybe don't have that voice or can't find that voice yet, that you can be a vehicle to help them find their voice. And I think that's where this series of programmes became so important, that facing injustice, while Will's case isn't a miscarriage of justice, the childhood he went through, the ACEs that he suffered was definitely not correct. It was a miscarriage of justice in terms of a childhood. And now as an adult, I think he's trying to use that in a positive way and bring to attention the idea that people have their voices taken away, and the process of finding it is liberating, but you can use your voice in different ways. Not everybody will speak out. You can overcome having your voice taken away in different forms. And I think part of Will's healing is to be a vehicle for others, to try and help develop their voice by raising awareness about what it means to have your voice taken away. And I think that's a very crucial key part of his own healing process and moving forward and developing the person that he's becoming as an adult with that understanding of ACEs and everything else that he's been through. And within that, he develops the resilience and the empathy and the accountability that suffering ACEs often not only can take away from you, but often prevents you developing. And what you see now is someone who's using that in a positive way.
Why should these men and women not have a voice? Why should they sit there in silence after what's happened to them? Some of these men and women have spent 20 years in prison, lost relationships with their families, their loved ones. And that's it. They come out of prison, they get given a pardon, and they're supposed to sit there mutely and say nothing. No, not having it. They need their stories told. They need the public to be aware of it. The miscarriages of justice still happen to this day. And the public need to be aware of it. The public need to know that you can't always count on the powers that be. With victims of miscarriages of justice who've been exonerated, some of which have done 20 plus years in prison for crimes they didn't commit, lost family members along the way, missed funerals, birthdays. Some of their family and friends probably even thought they were guilty of the offence, especially with the amount of time they served. And when they've been released, they've had to rebuild their lives from scratch. Our first episode in the new year will feature Michael O'Brien from the Cardiff 3, who served 11 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. He's been fully exonerated now and fights for other victims of miscarriages of justice.